We're going to talk about Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is something that is not new. Juneteenth is something that's not new, but it may be new to some people. And so to many, this is something that's just come up off of the horizon. But to others, this is something that's been an awareness, a struggle, a reality, and a celebration for quite some time. So we're going to talk about and explore really what is Juneteenth and how does this fit into the conversation today? Because we're really trying to recognize that everyone is a child of God. We talked about the human dignity, that everyone deserves. We're made in the image and likeness of God, and yet recognizing the struggles that have happened. So I wanted to share some information. I do have a website, and I think we will be sharing that with you, again, dropping that in the link in just a few minutes. So there's a lot of information that you can find online. I recommend, and I think Deacon Matt, you would agree, Juneteenth is now a national holiday. Mm-hmm. And as we've talked about on previous holidays, they're not an opportunity just to not work. They're an opportunity to reflect on the point of the holiday, very much like our holy days, where we focus. And as we go through the liturgical calendar, we can go through our social calendar and do the same thing. So our challenge might be for you during this year's Juneteenth and every year, take a few minutes to do some research, to learn a little more, to have a conversation, to take some action. So just saying that, we'll share one resource with you. This is from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, produced by Smithsonian. Mm-hmm. And this is all about Juneteenth. And so they're saying senses of freedom, the taste, sound, and experience of an African American celebration. So they're talking about sort of today's experience. What can we do today? And I wanted to just share a little bit of history about Juneteenth that you may already know. But we know that, I believe it was 1863, President Lincoln established the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a government declaration that slavery would no longer be allowed in the United States. But it took some time, especially back in those days, not the world of the internet, for information to get around. And so a couple of years later, June 19, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and he brought the message that African Americans were now free. They're freed from the enslavement, and the Civil War had now ended. And so this was celebrated in this region for quite some time. It still took another period of years before this was widely known and practiced. So there was still some time, but this was the first group where this announcement was made. And so this is a celebration that's recognizing the freedom, that's seeing and hearing and understanding the experience that the slaves went through, that African Americans experienced unrighteously. And it was legal, but it was not ethical, it was not moral, and it should have never happened. So now there's a celebration that we can pause again and recognize the freedom that happened then. But as Deacon Matt, we've been talking about today, that we know we still experience racism, and we're fighting to try to disband that. There's been, if you read the history about Juneteenth, there's been struggles, declines in the recognition of this. I think early in the 1900s, there was a decline. There was the world wars that happened and sort of took the attention away. Of course, the economy, as we all know, suffered greatly back in the day. People couldn't afford to do anything extraordinary because this is the time where we come together and we kill the fatted calf, so to speak, to celebrate. So, but then there's also been other times where this has garnered momentum and more attention has been brought to this. And that's what I think the killing of George Floyd, and it's a series of events that have, I would say, brought the awareness of, unrighteous acts against certain groups of people, especially African Americans, to the surface. And it gained momentum very quickly to the point where last year this was declared a national holiday. Mm-hmm. So Deacon Matt, that's a brief historical background on Juneteenth. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, first of all, I appreciate the background. Only recently did I become aware of what Juneteenth was. And so I appreciate that knowledge and understanding now, and part of our country's history. I did learn another fact, which was that, and the reason I remember this is because it's the same year as my birthday. But in 1979, that Texas was the first state to make Juneteenth that official holiday. Now I wonder when all the other states, including my own, kind of followed in suit, or maybe they didn't, and it just took the making this a federal holiday that kind of took care of all that. But I want to go back to what you said earlier at the very beginning about Juneteenth and kind of memorializing things. That it's not just, hey, we get a day off. And it's not just we need to learn more about our country's history. It's a call to reflect on what has happened in regards to racism and injustice.
Right.
It's to reflect nationally on that and also personally on that. And because to your last point about trying to be heralds of good news, to get to the good news, sometimes we have to acknowledge the bad news. And about our struggle. Sorry, that's my kids.
It's okay.
And just the struggle of, you mentioned killing the fatted calf. That's a great example coming from the prodigal son parable. And before the son could be received back home, there had to be that acknowledgement that he did wrong. And I think moving through that path of reconciliation, going back to what Father Bell was saying, that's the path this country needs to be set upon. Not vindictiveness, not revenge, not violence, but reconciliation. You have to accept the bad news and deal with that so that you can get on with the good news.
We heard another lunch and learn this week that's focusing on Juneteenth. Father Bart, I believe, and that's what he was saying. We have to remember. We have to see this. We can't erase, in a sense, that part of our history. It's very important to see this and understand it, because without the valley, we don't have a mountaintop. And that's kind of what you're saying. It's not so that we can experience the mountaintop. We all would have rather avoided the valley, but we can't pretend that never happened. And to be able to appreciate true freedom, we have to see what happened. We have to understand that, and in a sense, relive it from our own perspective until it begins to motivate us to do enough, to take action, starting with ourselves. And then, like you said, maybe we're stepping out, we're joining a movement, we're going out and having conversations, or whatever it may look like. So yeah, absolutely. We can't erase that. As a matter of fact, we need to delve into that. And it's, I guess, not unlike as humans who sin. We have to see sin as something, a catalyst that can help us encounter healing, encounter Christ, and experience something greater. So anyway, I think a very rich conversation today, springboarding from this reality that we're all God's children, and yet it can be messy at times.
I really appreciate, you said it so beautifully at the end about you can't have the summit without the valley. And it made me think about, the story of the Exodus, which I know is so special to the Black experience. This idea of journeying out of slavery, but it's not like you get into the promised land right away. You go through this desert. And I feel like that's been the experience of so many people that have been marginalized in the history of this country. There's been this prolonged desert experience. And hopefully we're getting more to a place today where we can provide refreshment and be an oasis and be at the end of this desert journey and be in that promised land together. So I appreciate that metaphor of the valley and the summit.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I agree with what you're saying. And I'll just say that I feel honored to be able to talk about this today. I'm learning. I wish I could say that I understand everyone's reality completely. And I don't. I'm limited by my own personal experience. But I'm trying to learn and grow. So I found this enriching and rewarding to be able to have this conversation and try to bring the conversation forward.
Me too.